Hello everyone, and welcome back to Real History. I'm your host, History Professor Jared Frederick. And as you well know by this point, we are deep in our analysis of HBO's The Pacific. And once more, I am joined by Henry Sledge, a son of Eugene Sledge, key protagonist as featured in the series. Thank you so much for joining us for part 6.
Well, thanks for the interest and thanks for letting me do this.
All right. We left off last time with a little bit of a cliffhanger.
Yeah.
They had just arrived on Peleliu. A lot of the fighting around the airfield is afoot. And this is truly where your dad becomes the primary focus of attention in the series. Why do you think the producers decided to put so much emphasis, 3 entire episodes, on the Battle of Peleliu in the series?
I think because in the past, Peleliu has not gotten a lot of attention and treatment, and certainly on film. When my dad wrote With the Old Breed, Peleliu was the forgotten battle. Like you and I have talked about, Jared, I certainly don't think it's a forgotten battle anymore.
Right.
But probably largely that is due to the fact that when you look at With the Old Breed and the way he wrote of his experience, that was his baptism of fire. There was so much visceral, emotionally intense human experience and drama for him as a person, for him as a Marine, for all of them that occurred at Peleliu. And I think it just was such an iconoclastic battle. You know, I think it was Time correspondent Robert Martin that said, he said in the wake of Peleliu, he said, for sheer brutality and fatigue, Peleliu surpasses anything yet seen in the Pacific. And that is a horrifically beautiful statement because it just sums it up, I think. And I think the filmmakers wanted to capture the essence of that.
And I think they do. On that note, let's go ahead and get started.
So this opening shot is my grandparents' house. It's supposed to be my grandparents' house in Mobile. I like the way they had the Spanish moss. They spent a tremendous amount of money to import that Spanish moss for that scene.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it was not indigenous to that part of Australia. Great shot. I mean, that's like looking into my grandmother's dining room and the front parlor of the house. They just did a wonderful job of recreating the interior. And my brother being an architectural historian, and you see the corner cabinet to the right there that we have upstairs.
Oh, wow, yeah.
Obviously, that's not the actual one. I thought Linda Cropper did a great job playing my grandmother. I've probably already said that, but I think she really captured the essence of Mary Frank Sledge.
It's a man in a uniform, man.
So there's a little bit of suspense here at the moment. A man in uniform comes to the door, and there's this unspoken fear that perhaps there's a Western Union telegram or some sort of dreadful notification coming. Perhaps I read in Sid Phillips' book, though, that they actually knew that he was coming, and they in fact let him borrow a car. Am I remembering that correctly?
I actually don't know that.
Okay.
But it certainly would stand to reason, and you know, a little bit of artistic license, certainly understandable. And you can imagine, again, as I've spoken already, with my grandparents, you have one son in the thick of it in Europe, and in the 741st Tank Battalion as a tank platoon commander, and then your other son is in the thick of it in the Pacific. I mean, I can't imagine a greater stress for a mother and a father. But you see, I really thought the Sid Phillips character does a great job of, you know, you see that knowing look he gives my grandfather.
Yeah.
And my grandfather's, you know, he's been around the block. He understands that, you know, that things are probably worse than Sid is portraying them, but Sid doesn't want Eugene's parents to worry. You get a sense when they pull in here and you hear that ominous music, and then the first thing you see is that blazing sun. Now, So my father's writing in his Bible right there. So I've got this. This is not that Bible. Obviously, that's a prop. But that is Sledgehammer's Bible.
That is so unbelievable. Wow. That is, yeah,
That was always, of all the artifacts of my father's that I have, my mother cherished that the most. And she always said that that Bible is so key. It is so centric to the beginning of all of this, you know, because it's literally the wellspring of what became With the Old Breed. And I wish I had a copy of my dad's book I could hold up. But
that was incredible.
You know, but he would have sat up late at night in the years not too long after the war with that and writing notes on yellow legal pads, which I remember him writing in pencil on yellow legal pads when I was a really young kid late at night when I would get out of bed and come into the living room or into the den, whatever, and he'd be sitting in front of the fireplace doing that. I don't remember holding the Bible in his hand. I think what he actually did was when he came home, he took the Bible and then made an outline of the things that had been on little pieces of paper. And there's a little bit of writing in the first 2 pages. It's really just an outline of times and places and dates. But I'm so glad that Tom Hanks and company show this because it's so key to the Sledge story, him writing in that Bible. And actually I'm in conversation with the Library of Congress. They are very interested in having the Eugene Sledge Bible for their collection.
Very fitting, very appropriate. Thank you so much for sharing this with us. That's incredibly special.
And in almost every, he's writing 105 to 115 degrees. I've been asked, what happened to the little pieces of paper. They're lost to the sands of time. I mean, who knows, because honestly, you think not long after the war, he would have written those notes out in outline form and then probably threw those pieces of paper away, honestly. And now we're seeing the shelling begin to pick up on the edge of the airfield.
How you doing?
Snafu's still the hard ass here. He really hasn't completely decided if he likes this Sledge guy or not. And of course the dungaree jacket, which I have on the wall, not that one, but the one my dad wore in theater.
It's amazing that it survived. When you look at, herringbone twill uniforms or fatigues, so many guys, if they survived the war, if the clothing survived the war, they would just wear it around the house or the yard or the farm. I think it really, I've said this before, it really speaks to the sense of foresight that your dad had and how meticulously he preserved these things.
That's a good point, Jared. I mean, it's almost like, I'm going to sound pretentious if I say that, but it's almost like my dad knew that he was going to write his story and it would become public knowledge. And I hate to say it's almost like he knew he was going to become, people tell me he's famous. He was a self-deprecating guy, and I try to be too, and I feel weird saying that, but he is. I think he is a pretty famous guy, and it's almost like he knew that, and he just kept so many of his things.
Hallelujah. Pass my helmet.
What we're seeing here really closely follows what my dad wrote in With the Old Breed. They find a water source, they start dipping canteens and helmets into it, and then of course realize it's been poisoned.
A really good detail here goes to the geology of Peleliu. There's a lot of limestone all throughout the island. You'll notice the water is a chalky white.
Right.
And that is from the limestone deposits that are everywhere throughout the island. So
that's a great point.
A great little detail.
I actually go into limestone quarries quite a bit in my job, and there are frequently pools of water out in those quarries, and they're that exact color.
Quit whining. It'll all be over by the time you cross.
Japs take mortars and bazookas as much as riflemen, Laden.
I was in a podcast with Bruce McKenna, and we were talking about this scene, and I did that. Japs hate mortars and bazookas as much as they hate riflemen, Bill Laden. And Bruce said, man, that is a perfect Ramy Malek. But Ramy just did a great job. He was such a nice guy. You know, we hung out with him in New Orleans at an event in the lead up to this, and he was just such a nice guy. So well spoken, and so was Joe when we met Joe Mazzillo. And they're really cherishing that last little bit of water.
Mm-hmm. Not only because they're parched, because it's potentially the last swig of liquid that they're ever going to drink.
Yeah, absolutely.
Get off your ass. Get under that gear. We're moving shortly.
Gunny always seems to be somewhat omnipresent. It seems like he's everywhere, coming from nowhere. He's just this all-seeing eye, keeping an eye on the platoon, doing exactly what a Gunny should be doing.
Exactly. Now you see Snafu kind of taking a little bit of, softening up a little bit on the Sledge character and giving him a puff of his cigarette when he'd been a little hard on him a few minutes ago. What the hell you doing? Break your shit down. And
earlier in the book, your dad says, I don't smoke.
Yeah.
And of course, by the time he's done on Peleliu, he is smoking.
Yeah. Yeah, that actually, in the book, it's after they move in on the first day, and he's like, somebody give me a cigarette.
Right.
And Snafu was jubilant. I told you you'd be smoking every cigarette you could get your hands on.
See you on the other side.
Let's go!
One of the coolest things about my trip to Peleliu in 1999 was I was with a good buddy named Eric Maylander who had been to Peleliu. At that point, that was his 7th trip.
Wow.
And I told him, I said, Eric, put me on that airfield right where K-35 would have gone across. And he did. And, it was around the middle of the day. It was pretty hot, and the sun was, at its peak. And I mean, it's just off that limestone coral. The heat waves are just shimmering. And I just, the other guys were like, let's just give him a few minutes to kind of walk around. And I just, that spot where I knew they went across, I just kind of walked back and forth and just tried to take it all in, I mean, it was pretty moving.
And with the old breed, I recall him writing that the scene seemed to him something reminiscent of something that he had watched in a World War I film, just this mass charge moving across no man's land to immense slaughter.
Well, I mean, because the Japanese had them pegged, they had them zeroed, and they had they had to get across, to get to the base of the Brogel and begin pushing north and northeast on the island. This was the scene when I was at the We Have Ways Fest in England with James Holland. One night they showed clips of various World War II movies and did little, quick critiques, either humorous or not so humorous, most of the time humorous. But when they showed this clip, both Al Murray and James Holland were just like, it's just some of the most beautiful television I've ever seen. Did you notice the daubs of dark paint on Lieutenant Spearman's pack? That you were asking about the paint on my dad's pack. You could really see it to good effect. Burned out remains of a G4M2 Betty bomber.
As we once again consider the significance of the airfield, I believe the following year that the PBY, the aircraft that discovered the survivors of the USS Indianapolis, actually took off from this very airfield. So
you are correct.
So yes. Surely the survivors of the Indianapolis were grateful that the Marines took this airfield.
The airfield on Peleliu was such a key airfield. I mean, at one time, it was a very active Japanese naval air base. Now, there obviously, with carrier raids from Bull Halsey's carrier task forces in the spring of 44, and there were probably a series of those, all the Japanese aerial opposition or aerial strength in the Palau Islands had been wiped out, which is why by the time we invade Peleliu, you see, you know, the bombed out remains of Japanese bomber and fighter aircraft, because there really were no air forces. They were already driven out of the area at that point. But it was a hugely active naval air base prior to 1944. Anything in the any Japanese forces going between the Philippines and then, say, to Truk, far to the east of there, you know, the Palau Islands were going to be a stopover point. And I also know that the air base at Peleliu, once we occupied it and fortified it, it was a regular stopover point for evacuation aircraft carrying wounded from the Philippines back out to the east. Back east. I had gotten a web pistol belt at a surplus store, and I remember my dad explaining to me, you know, how you hooked it together, and you know, how he wore his, and that kind of thing. And I remember him talking about it. He says, "See how thick that fabric is," and then he described to me, which he described verbatim and with the old breed, how they're charging across the airfield, and he hears this whirring piece of metal come right across, and snafu goes down with a just like we see there. And again, I mean, he wrote it the way he described it to me when I was a kid. You know, Dad crawls over to snafu and he sees that snafu's okay, and he sees this inch square piece of hot metal. And they don't really show it here, but my father wrote in with the old breed about how he picked it up and was bouncing it in his hand because it was sizzling hot. And of course, there was so much shell fire and machine gun fire, they couldn't hear each other. And snafu was motioning for him to put it in his pack, and my dad opened his pack and threw it in there. And I've wondered whatever happened to that piece of metal.
Wow.
Man, but my dad talked about how on the pistol belt was frayed from where that fragment had struck him right in the belt, and the belt had stopped it. But I've wondered if anybody in the Shelton family still has that piece of metal.
With all the pyrotechnics and special effects used in this sequence, one really gets the sense that they spared no expense in trying to replicate this to the best that they could.
Agreed.
And you very much see where they spent that $200 million plus budget. This is just astounding, the level of detail and the scope that one sees here.
Yep. Yeah, well said. I mean, they absolutely did. They get the mortar ready to go, and they say hanging, fire one, hanging, fire two. I mean, that sounds really cool. I like that. It plays well on film. I don't know if that's terminology that they used back then. I never, my dad never wrote that, but that doesn't mean they didn't say it. I'm not saying that, but that's something I've kind of wondered about.
Let's go, King, come, they move out!
Hillbilly Jones is very reminiscent of somebody like Ronald Spears in moments like this. A person who seems impervious to danger or gunfire, the sort of person who's in the right place at the right moment to urge the men onward.
Hillbilly was a great officer, and of course, in my dad's book, he writes about how it was Hillbilly and Sergeant Teskovich, who it was around twilight, probably third day or so of the battle, and my father's sitting there and they're having a conversation. My dad wrote of he heard Hillbilly was talking about his childhood, and the Teskovich was from a kind of the Rust Belt, kind of a hard scrabble industrial working class background, and they're having this great conversation. I mean, these are two iconic combat veterans in my dad's first battle, and my father was just talking about what a gentleman Hillbilly was and how highly he thought of him, but that was that moment, which they did not replicate here. But when my father heard that voice say, "You will survive the war," And I love this LVT that we see right here.
I need you to take our wounded back to the beach. No can do. We're moving out.
I remember Richard Frank telling me that every time they fired those amphibious tractors up, the budget just, because those things drink a lot of fuel. And that really, they wanted to not have too many scenes. And you see the grousers on the treads, those W-shaped grousers that would catch the water and push the vehicle forward.
Hold here till we load our wounded. Then you can move your ass wherever you want.
Yes, sir.
I think that's a nice shot of the naval presence right there.
He's gone. Get him below. Put that up, dumb.
For as much pain as Lucky here is in, he was later actually angry about his wounding for reasons other than what we would immediately think, because one of the first things that came to his mind was, why am I so lucky to get wounded?
Yeah.
Because he said, even though I'm in pain, this is my ticket out of here. And for that reason, he thought he was fortunate. So it really speaks to the carnage of Peleliu, that a guy that gets this horrible internal injury thinks that he's getting off easy.
Yeah. I mean, I think anybody who was there that first day could see that this was not going to be a walkover.
Just as easily been me counting Japs I can't see.
But it's not you. You handled yourself well today, Sledge. You'll be all right. Just remember your training.
Now, this scene that we're seeing here, Bruce told me that it's as if, you see Snafu kind of sitting up in the rafters there looking down on the scene, and you see, Daniels is just pretty much at the end of his rope. Then Ack and Hillbilly come by, and Hillbilly starts, he tells my dad, you handled yourself well today, Sledge. And the way Snafu looks at Sledge, that's the moment when he realizes that this guy may be okay. This guy's okay.
I have to believe that every step across that airfield, every man that's wounded, every man I lose, that it's all worthwhile because our cause is just. Of course, if a just cause came with some hot food and cold water, then it'll be okay too.
And that's pretty much as preachy as this film gets. That's the only little bit of patriotic fervor that we see in the entire film. I think hats off to the writers for doing so, for not banging us over the head.
Yeah, the jingoistic.
Right.
Yeah, because in that moment, you think those guys give a crap about that. They just want some water. They just want to get through the next day, preferably without getting blown to bits. I mean, and I agree with you. I mean, the Pacific kind of kept that. And I'm not saying that Band of Brothers didn't keep it to a minimum, but I agree that was. I think they hewed to the kind of the right tone.
We're moving into the hills. Let's move, people.
Pork chops. Pork chops. That's my meat. LST 661. About time. Thank you.
So this scene right here, I don't know if you know this, we see Hugh Ambrose in this scene. Did you know that?
Oh, no, I didn't.
Yeah, there he is right there holding the pork chops from LST 661.
We ain't supposed to write shit down, Gives the Japs valuable intel, they find it.
Guess I won't show it to them then.
I love this scene.
Got it smoked. Thanks, Sledgehammer.
Sledgehammer. I like that.
I call it the thanks Sledgehammer a lot. This scene right here, remember Bruce telling me when they wrote this scene, this is where they bring the nickname Sledgehammer in.
Don't worry, we got a nickname for you too, Bill Laden. We call you Ball-Peen Hammer. It's like a little hammer for a little man.
I really like the interplay here. Because Snafu, he's a smart ass, and Sledge gives him that, well, I guess I won't show it to him. And he kind of looks at him like, yeah, okay, I got you. I asked my dad, when did they start calling you Sledgehammer? And he said, I really don't even know. I don't remember ever being called anything else. and I don't know who started it. It just kind of came into being. But that scene right there, that's the one, you know, when I have friends that haven't seen this, I'll pull up that scene on YouTube and show them that scene, you know. Thanks, Sledgehammer. That's a great scene.
As is customary for the time period, everybody's smoking. They were issued with rations. They didn't know the adverse health effects. They believed that it had a calming, soothing effect when you were in these tense situations. Did your dad continue to smoke in the years after the war?
No. He absolutely detested cigarettes. Detested them. I actually talk about that a lot in my manuscript, but my father could not stand. Now, he smoked pipe. He did continue that, but he detested cigarettes. But being a biologist, being the scientist that he was, I mean, it you know, the deleterious effects of it, I mean, he just went on and on about that, you know. And this is a beautiful depiction. When you look out across that draw.
Looks like 2 heavy Nambu machine guns.
The capturing the essence of that topography on that terrain on Peleliu, they did a phenomenal job with that. There's one shot, and we're about to see it, where you just see, like, you get a moment where you see those Japanese emplaced with their Nambu machine guns. But that was Peleliu. I mean, you couldn't expose yourself. And my father talked about how superb the Japanese fire discipline was. You know, and I would suggest to our viewers, contrast this with, go back to part 2, when they're just coming over the barbed wire in waves. And they've got the 30 cal machine guns and they're just mowing them down. And I'm not suggesting that was easy. That's not my point, but just the Japanese adapted to their terrain. Kuno Nakagawa was the Japanese officer, the Japanese commander of the forces on Peleliu, and he was, I can't say it better than my friend Eric Maylander said it, he was a tactical genius.
Do you think he'll come back?
You disobey orders, you get court-martialed.
The ever-present star shells at night. This scene right here is supposed to be when they go on the 40-man patrol into the mangrove swamp, which is, you know, we see what happens here shortly, but that, I remember going through that mangrove swamp area on my trip in 1999, and I wish I'd spent more time in that general area, but Eric Maylander, my buddy, who was quarterbacking the whole, you know, guiding us to the key sites. I mean, he said, yeah, this is the mangrove swamp. He and I have corresponded a lot, and I want to go back. And when I do, I want to, of course, they don't have the time to show it here, but I want to actually hike that same route that K-35 took on that patrol into the mangrove swamp. And I'd like to spend the night out there, because it's pretty cool the way my dad described it. You know, it started raining late that night, and like it was just complete blackness, and they can't really portray that here, but they capture some of it. My father had a conversation with who was it? It was one of the NCOs, Hank Boys. I think Hank Boys was on this patrol. And Hank Boys is not depicted in the miniseries, but he was just an iconic K-35 NCO. But my dad had a conversation with him at a reunion about that patrol, and Hank told him, he said, Sledgehammer, what I knew but I couldn't tell you guys is that was a death patrol. They were sending us out there to draw fire and probe the lines on that, I think it was on the southeastern promontory. And he said, we were a death patrol. But this is a very tragic, I remember my mom watched the miniseries many times, and she said this part is just so hard to watch.
Was your mother pleased with the depiction of her husband?
She was. She was very pleased with the depiction of her husband. She, you know, as we've talked about in the months and the early years after the Pacific came out, when I was pretty expressive of my, at the time, less than positive opinion of it, she would kind of scold me and say, now, Henry, they did a good job here. And, now she watched it a few times, but yes, she was pleased with the depiction of her husband.
I guess better him than all of us.
That better him than all of us. I mean, it was so tragic, but, and then Snafu acknowledges Sledgehammer's right. That was such a tough thing.
Sledgehammer's right. Had to be done.
There's really not a bad performance in the whole thing.
No, I do agree with you.
Such great casting.
Yep. I think about the portrayal of my dad. When you think about it, I'd like your opinion on this, Jared. I mean, for a main character, Sledge doesn't have just this surplus of dialogue. He's, for a main character, I mean, at times it's almost like he's a man of few words. But I mean, I think Joe portrayed it well. And then, of course, this was, what happened. I mean, Hillbilly got on the radio the next morning after that happened and got on the radio with Major Gustafson, who was battalion commander. And Major Gustafson wanted him to stay out longer. And Hillbilly told him, we had a pretty bad night. I really think we need to come in. And my father could overhear that conversation on the radio because he and Snafu were dug in pretty close to that where they were bivouacked, and it was just obvious respect that Major Gustafson had for Hillbilly's judgment to say, okay, I'll send a relief column with a tank in case you have any trouble.
Whoever's up there is getting pounded.
Hey. Let's go home, Carter.
I love this. Now, somebody could look at that and say it's too much CGI or whatever. I'm not a graphics expert. I think it's pretty damn powerful.
Yeah, and it's taken directly from Lecky's book. Yep. And I remember a key sentence in particular of this moment where he says, I stared in morbid fascination back at the island. He was incredibly relieved that he was on the deck of this ship, that he was no longer on the island. But it was like looking at a car wreck or a tornado. You couldn't help but be drawn to it.
Yeah, just a great way to close out that episode.
As we wrap things up, I'd like to ask you a question about historical memory and how we remember these events. And I think it's also true of Band of Brothers. For a lot of the veterans who wrote their memoirs after this series came out, I often wonder, did they remember things as they really happened or as they were portrayed in the series? And I'd like to ask you a similar question. Are there moments when you think of your dad's experiences where you don't think of him and how he told it, but rather you envision the film instead?
That's a great point. I will say there were some memoirs that came out in the wake of this. They came out on the coattails of the Pacific, and I'm not going to mention names and titles. People who have read the books know who I'm talking about, know what I'm talking about. And you touched on something that I think is pretty valid. Does a guy who write a memoir, and pretty much all these cases, these men had ghostwriters. They didn't write them themselves. There was one particular case where one person, I won't say he took issue. He was careful what he said about my father, because had he stepped over the line, I would have addressed it. He didn't, but he comes just short of it, of questioning some of the things my father did. He certainly is critical of the mortarmen. And I really take issue with that because, for one thing, 60 millimeter mortarmen were anywhere from 100 yards back to 20 yards back. Sometimes they were right there. There were times when the 60s put aside their mortars and acted as riflemen. That happened a lot on Okinawa. I think you get caught up in watching a film, and I can think of another memoir where a particular instance happened that I think somebody was remembering something maybe the way they wanted to remember it. I'm not saying there was any complete obfuscation of the truth. I'm not going to go that far, but little nuanced aspects of something. I think there were cases where guys were remembering things what, 70 years later, they're remembering it the way they want to remember it. My dad wrote his book himself. He didn't have a ghostwriter who just sat there and listened to him talk and then wrote it all down. He wrote it himself. He did the research himself. He began writing when it was fresh in his mind. Now, the second part of your question, when I think of my dad's experience, do I picture the film? It's both. For me, I've reread With the Old Breed many times, and I picture the way they filmed it because I think they did a great job. But when I read With the Old Breed, I've been through it so many times, certainly researching the unedited parts for my own manuscript. I'm picturing it in my own mind. So it's a combination of both. It's not as binary. The answer's not as binary as perhaps you might wish, but in my mind, it's both.
It's a fascinating thing to be thinking about as we ponder how Hollywood shapes what we know, or in some cases what we think we know of the past. So I look forward to carrying on the conversation in our next episode as we continue to analyze the Battle of Peleliu. Thank you so much for your insights.
Well, thanks.
We'll see you next time on Real History as we continue to examine the Pacific. Take care.
Am I talking too much?
No.
Okay.
Quite the contrary.
Okay. I just...
Go ahead and start that thought over.